My time with the Sega Genesis was filled with some unforgettable games. From the early days with Revenge's Shinobi to the later stuff like Phantasy Star 4, there was no shortage of software to keep me busy. Even now in 2021, new games continue to flow for Sega's nearly 35-year-old hardware. That means that there are quite a few games out there that slip under the radar and rarely get talked about. While video after video on YouTube praise games like Streets of Rage or one of the Shinobis, tons go unremembered and unappreciated. This is often because the forgotten games are nowhere near as good as the classics, but that doesn't mean they are complete garbage. In this episode, we are going to go over some Sega Genesis games that rarely get much of the spotlight. Some of these are good enough to add to your playlist, while some deserve to be forgotten, never to be heard from again. Let's go ahead and look at some forgotten Sega Genesis games. In 1990, Traco released a port of the arcade game Atomic Robo Kid for the Sega Genesis. It's a multi-directional shooter with a twist. You control the scrolling of the screen and must battle respawning enemies across a ravaged planet under alien siege. Your job of course is to kill all the unwanted and uninvited guests, including some rather large boss characters. You get some nice color, large sprites, and there are a few layers between the foreground and backgrounds. The sound can be a bit too harsh and the reappearing enemies can make stages really hard, but I like it overall. As far as shoot 'em ups go, it's not a classic, but it's different and I think that goes a long way for the genre. If you want something challenging and action-packed, give it a try. Insector X is another 1990 release based on an arcade game, this one originally by Taito. Hot B handled the Genesis port here, a really strange shoot 'em up involving robotic insects. You are the last survivor of your race and must exact revenge on the robo insects that are responsible. This is a fairly competent shooter that has a decent power-up system and challenge. It likely goes unnoticed because of the lackluster presentation. While the sprites look okay, the backgrounds are rather plain and suffer a distinct lack of layering, something Genesis shooters usually excelled at. The music is really low-key too, almost completely lost under the sound effects. It's a real shame too, because if you added a couple of decent songs and spruced up the backgrounds a bit, this one could have been a real contender. It's still worth some playtime, so if you are a fan of the genre, fire it up and give it some love. I remember enjoying the arcade version of Street Smart by SNK. It looked good and was simple to learn. When Traco brought it to the Genesis 2 years later in 1991, I recall having some fun with it as well. But revisiting it for the capture here was a painful exercise in tedium. While it is a one-on-one fighting game, the mechanics feel more like Double Dragon than Street Fighter 2. Lots of repeated moves while you try your best to score multiple hits on your opponent. A lot of the gameplay seems random and you'll have moments where you kick ass and moments where you are utterly destroyed by the AI. There is an upgrade system in place to help your life and power stats, but the game is still incredibly hard. You do have a special attack, but it takes life if you can believe it. It still holds up visually, but the music is kinda weak, as are the sound effects. The simple fact is, this is a lot better as a two-player game. With a friend in tow, the gameplay is much more tolerable. It reminds me of the versus modes in games like Streets of Rage, so if you found some fun there, you likely will here as well. At the end of 1991, Traco was back again with Fighting Masters, another one-on-one fighter. This time the setting was far from Earth and had a cast of alien fighters that ranged from humans to dragon men. The gameplay here is quite a bit different than Street Smart. Instead of the randomness seen in the former, Fighting Masters relies on a 2-button stun and grapple system that actually works fairly well. The idea is that your regular attacks will temporarily stun your opponent, and gives you the opportunity for a number of different throws and wrestling style maneuvers. The engine is overall very simplistic and nowhere near as deep as later fighting games like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter II, but this still can be very fun, especially for a younger audience. In fact, playing it with your kids is a blast. There's no D-pad motions to master here, and button mashing can actually yield some wicked results, so it's easy for younger warriors to do well. The audio and visual quality is rather low, and I was particularly bothered by the lack of decent backgrounds to fight against. Still, not a bad fighting game for the younger crowd, and the wrestling-style grappling system is easy to learn and understand. Like Street Smart, it's also much better with 2 players. Confession time. I chose DJ Boy on a whim. I remember renting it as a kid, a 1990 beat-em-up starring a construction worker on roller skates trying to recover his stolen radio. 2 minutes in, I regretted this choice. I totally did not recall this game being as bad as it is. You start out each area in an auto-scrolling segment that has you rolling past enemies you can barely hit. You're better off avoiding as much interaction as possible here, as you'll soon have your hands full with the stationary areas that reveal the terrible gameplay even further. It's tough to hit anything even when you're standing still, and once you get to the boss of the level, it gets even more frustrating. And guess what? One death, just a single lost life, sends you back to the title screen to start from the beginning. What in the holy hell were the developers thinking? After restarting on the first stage 3 or 4 times, I said to hell with this mess. Having a look at the box for this, I noticed that there are no pics of the game and absolutely no information about gameplay or content. I'm pretty damn sure Kaneko knew what they had here and advertised it accordingly. In 1992, Rare developed a version of their RC Pro-Am game for the Genesis called Championship Pro-Am. This isometric racer is extremely easy to pick up and play, and is very similar to what appeared on Nintendo's hardware. You get weapons like missiles and bombs to slow down your opponents, and you can get power-ups for your speed and handling. The premise is simple: collect what you can, get rid of the other cars, and place as high as possible. The graphics and sound are nothing special, but it's fun enough and you can play with a friend. Despite being released in 1992, it came on a tiny 2 megabit cartridge, which was almost unheard of at that point. I don't think the size holds this one back though. The gameplay here is what really mattered, and I quite enjoyed taking it for a spin on a few tracks here and there. There are better racers on the Genesis to be sure, but this one is still worth a go, especially if you enjoyed the original NES release. Being a sports fan, I was always intrigued by Super Volleyball. It was released in 1991 by Video System and isn't something I'd call your normal video game. The 2 megabit cartridge seems to be almost entirely dedicated to the animation, because there is nothing else here but color swaps and the same arenas to play in. I wanted to be good at the gameplay but never quite got there, but I still find it a decent playing experience for what it is. Just choose a country from the short list, serve the ball, and try to be the one to keep it in play. I can't stress enough how much better this is with a second player. The AI plays the same all the time, so the randomness of human control really helps the fun factor. The Genesis was known for some great sports games across the many leagues out there, so you can imagine Volleyball got lost in the mix quite quickly. If you find yourself wanting something different, this is challenging to learn and is a blast to play with a friend. Speaking of sports games that are different, 1990's Cyberball was my go-to when it came out. Sega ported this to the Genesis, which was based on the arcade game by Atari. The premise is straightforward. You must use your team of robots to score points before the ball explodes. It's loosely based on NFL rules, but differs in a few key points. You need to defuse the ball by gaining yards within a certain time limit. This is pure arcade-style action, no simulation BS here. Quickly choose your play and then time flies by. The graphics and sound are about as plain as they can be, but again, the gameplay is what matters. If you don't like football, this isn't going to change that, but if you play video game sports, give it a try. The passing system takes some getting used to, and the AI can be relentless sometimes, but it's still a fun one to waste 20 minutes on here and there. A second player improves things immensely, and can make for a great afternoon with a friend. Superscalers on the old Genesis had an uphill battle. With no dedicated hardware, developers had to build their own engines to replicate the effect. Some simply used different sized images and moved them towards the screen quickly, while others genuinely built a software scaler. These games had varying levels of success. Some looked convincing but were nowhere near as smooth as the arcade machines that were designed to do it. When Chase HQ 2 showed up in 1992, I was really interested in playing it. I knew of the original and thought the Genesis should be able to do something close to it. And while the gameplay can be fun, the graphics engine here is just awful. The movement of the road is jerky and funky feeling, and sometimes you are thrown into curves you simply cannot hold even with the brake fully pressed. This really is annoying because the classic Chase HQ gameplay is here and in full effect. You can choose different vehicles with different stats, and these stats matter because the enemies you are running down have their own set of stats like speed and armor. Despite the weak visuals, I still think this one is worth playing. Taito published it, and it was called Super HQ in Japan. In 1992, Sega published Tailspin, based on the Disney cartoon of the same name. It was developed by Interactive Designs, who was also responsible for Green Dog and Eternal Champions on the Genesis. You often hear me criticize Fantasia, but this one here is just as bad. I hadn't played this one in a while, so I was hoping some more time with it might change my mind. Absolutely not. This still plays as poorly as ever. It falters in just about every way. The hit detection is poor, the stage design is terrible, and you often are confused as to what exactly you need to do or where to go. There are some shooting stages mixed in there as well, but they don't help matters any, as you are often pelted with enemies constantly. The entire point of the game is to collect crates so you can open up the exit. Gameplay beyond that is collecting more crates and stacking them to get to higher ground. The crap sound and music piles on, and by the second or third stage you really begin to hate this. Even if you love the original show, I still can't recommend it. I wanted to like it, especially since it has two-player co-op, but the design is so poor, it destroys any of the appeal. It's another game Sega of America was ultimately responsible for, and like so many others, left the Genesis worse off because of it. This episode is really just a list of games I haven't thought about in a while. Some of you likely have played these recently or even own some of them. I like to do episodes like this every so often, not just to expand the type of games I cover, but to also refreshen my memory. After playing games for nearly 40 years now, it's actually quite easy to forget what a lot of games were about. Hell, it's even easier to get some of them mixed up. Revisiting this group, it was clear none of them are must-owns or top of their class, but some are still very playable and worth owning. No doubt that some of these have been forgotten for very good reason. They flat out sucked, and I was quickly reminded of that fact after only a few minutes of gameplay. I'd also like to take a moment and comment just how much better some of these are with a second player. Just a few minutes alone with Cyberball, Fighting Masters, Super Volleyball, and Street Smart can put you to sleep, they're so boring. But add in a friend, a child, or spouse, and all of a sudden you have something worth playing. I think many games back then fell into that category. There were many games that didn't have much in the way of single-player appeal, but once you had someone on a second controller, things improved immensely. I'm Sega X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.